He came home from his fourth round of chemotherapy, weak and disoriented, only to find his keys no longer fit the lock, and his wife's voice from inside telling him to go away. But she didn't know who was watching from across the street. The man's name was Robert. For months, he had endured the poison meant to save him, trusting his wife Clara to be his safe harbor. Instead, she used that day of profound weakness to execute a plan so cold, it would hinge on a single witness. That witness was Dr. Aris Thorne, and he wasn't just any neighbor, he was Robert's oncologist. So what does a doctor do when his patient's emergency isn't medical, but matrimonial? To understand the brutality of that moment on the porch, you have to rewind 18 months. Robert wasn't always a patient. He was a history teacher, a man who believed in the clear causality of past and present. His diagnosis of stage 3 colon cancer in the spring wasn't just a medical verdict. It was a fracture line running through the middle of a 28-year marriage. At first, Clara was the portrait of a devoted caregiver. She took notes at oncology appointments. She managed the complex medication schedule. Friends brought casseroles and called her a saint. But by the 4th month, a subtle shift occurred. The questions Clara asked Dr. Thorne changed. They were less about Robert's white blood cell counts and more about his long-term cognitive function, less about nausea management, more about power of attorney logistics. Dr. Thorne noted the change in his chart, a brief note on Robert's psychosocial support system. Spouse appears increasingly focused on logistical and financial contingencies. Robert, meanwhile, was focused on survival. The chemotherapy was a brutal, every-other-week ritual. He'd leave the infusion center hollowed out, his body racked with a fatigue that felt gravitational. Home was his only sanctuary. And then 6 weeks before the lock change, a new name entered the household lexicon: Mark, Clara's friend from the gym who was so handy. Mark, who started coming by for coffee when Robert was at treatments. Mark, who fixed the gutter. Mark, whose truck began appearing in the neighborhood with a frequency that Dr. Thorne, walking his dog each evening, registered subconsciously before he understood why. The financial pressure was the other silent symptom. Robert was on long-term disability, his income cut by 40%. Clara had never worked. The savings, substantial but not infinite, began to drain. A meeting with a financial advisor ended in a quiet argument Robert overheard from the bedroom. Clara's voice, sharp and low: "I will not be left destitute because of this." The plan, it seems, began to crystallize then, a plan that required a specific kind of opportunity. It arrived on a Thursday. Robert's treatment schedule was a known variable. Infusion at 10 a.m., home by 3 p.m., followed by 16 hours of profound incapacitation. He was a clockwork vulnerability. On that Thursday, Robert received his pre-medication cocktail of steroids and anti-nausea drugs, then the slow, toxic drip of oxaliplatin. He left the center, as usual, leaning on a volunteer's arm. Dr. Thorne, leaving his own shift, saw him in the parking lot and gave a reassuring nod. He had no idea he'd be following Robert's car slowly all the way to their shared cul-de-sac. Clara's timeline was precise. At 2 p.m., a locksmith's van, unmarked, parked in the driveway for 14 minutes. At 2:45, a moving crew arrived, not for furniture, but for boxes, Robert's boxes from his study and the den. At 3:10, Mark's truck pulled into the garage, and the door did not go back up. Robert arrived at 3:20. He fumbled with his keys, the neuropathy in his fingers making them clumsy. The new deadbolt refused to turn. Then Clara's voice filtered through the polished oak. "Robert, just go, don't make this harder." This was the scene Dr. Aris Thorne walked into, not as an oncologist, but as a man carrying his mail. He saw his patient, pale and swaying, hands braced against the doorframe. He heard the unfamiliar voice from inside call out, "Honey, is he leaving?" And in that moment, Dr. Thorne's two worlds, the clinical and the communal, collided. The Hippocratic Oath isn't a document that stays at the hospital. It imprints on your instincts. He moved toward Robert, his professional eye assessing tachycardia, probable dehydration, acute distress. But his neighbor's mind was recording evidence: the new lock, the strange truck, the chilling domesticity of that other man's voice. He guided Robert to the curb, helped him sit. "Breathe, Robert, look at me, I'm right here." Then he turned to the house. He didn't knock, he didn't yell. He used the calm, carrying tone of a physician in a crisis. "Clara, this is Dr. Thorne. Robert is currently my patient, and he is in a medically precarious state. If you do not open this door, I will be obligated to call 911 for an acute psychosocial emergency and report what I am witnessing. That call will create a documented record. Do you understand?" The silence from inside was different now. The confidence was gone, replaced by a calculation they could almost hear. The door opened, but not all the way, just enough to show Clara's face, tight with a new, wary calculation. She looked past Robert, crumpled on the curb, and locked eyes with Dr. Thorne. "This is a private family matter, Doctor." "It stopped being private when you created a medical crisis on a public street," Thorne replied, his voice still calm. "Robert needs to lie down. He needs hydration. He is less than 3 hours post-infusion. Either he comes inside now, or I make the call and he goes to the ER. The report will note the cause as spousal abandonment during a documented medical procedure. Your choice." That phrase, spousal abandonment, hung in the air. It was no longer just a cruel act. It was a legal term. Clara's gaze flicked to Mark, a shadow in the hallway behind her. Then the door swung open. What Dr. Thorne saw inside was a snapshot of a plan in mid-execution. Cardboard boxes, half filled with Robert's books, were stacked in the living room. A familiar recliner, Robert's, was shoved into a corner. The space had been subtly but definitively reconfigured to exclude him. Thorne helped Robert to the bedroom, ignoring the tense silence of the other two. He performed a quick check, blood pressure elevated, pulse rapid. "You're in adrenaline crash on top of chemo crash," he said quietly. "You need to sleep. Can you do that?" Robert, shivering slightly, nodded. "Don't leave." "I'm not going anywhere," Thorne said. He closed the bedroom door and walked back into the living room. Clara and Mark stood together, a united front. "He's sleeping," Thorne said. "Now we talk." "There's nothing to talk about," Clara began, her earlier fear hardening into defiance. "Our marriage has been over for months. He just wouldn't accept it. Today was about setting a boundary." "With a locksmith and a mover," Thorne stated flatly. "On the day of his most debilitating treatment. That's not a boundary, Clara. That's a tactical eviction." Mark stepped forward. "Listen, Doc, you don't know the whole story." "I know enough," Thorne interrupted. "I know Robert's medical timeline because I created it. I know his vulnerability window. And I know that using that specific window to change locks and remove belongings could be construed by a court as an act of intentional infliction of emotional distress and possibly financial coercion. Are you aware that a spouse has a fiduciary duty of care during illness?" Clara paled. Mark shifted his weight. The medical authority was one thing, legal vocabulary from a doctor was another. "This is my house too," Clara said, but the edge was gone. "It's a marital asset," Thorne corrected gently, "and your husband's illness doesn't diminish his claim to it. If anything, it strengthens his need for secure housing. Now I'm going to go next door. I will be back in 1 hour to check on my patient. If he is disturbed, or if you attempt to remove him, I will call the police, and then I will call his attorney. Do we understand each other?" He didn't wait for an answer. He left, walking the 30 paces to his own home. His hands were steady, but his mind was racing. He had just inserted himself into a massive ethical and legal gray area, but the alternative, leaving Robert on that curb, was unthinkable. At home, he did two things. First, he documented everything: time, observations, direct quotes. He wrote it not in a patient chart that would be a HIPAA violation, but in a personal notebook, a contemporary log. Second, he called a lawyer friend, not for formal advice, but for a reality check. "You witnessed what exactly?" the friend asked. "A locked-out patient in active treatment, evidence of asset movement, and a new cohabitant in the marital home during what appears to be a planned exclusion." A low whistle on the line. "Aris, that's a powder keg. Your testimony is golden because you're a doctor and a neighbor. You have no financial stake, but tread carefully. You can't give medical advice about his marriage." "I'm not," Thorne said. "I'm managing a patient in a hostile environment." "Semantics," the lawyer said. Powerful ones, keep your log, take pictures of the boxes if you can, and for God's sake, get him a real lawyer tomorrow. Back at Robert's house an hour later, the atmosphere was icy but compliant. Robert was awake, sitting in the kitchen. Clara and Mark were in the living room, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Over the next 48 hours, Dr. Thorne became the improbable pivot point. He connected Robert with a formidable family law attorney, Susan Gray, who specialized in high-conflict divorces involving medical disability. Gray listened to Thorne's account and saw not just a case, but a narrative. "The oncologist neighbor," she said to Robert in their first meeting, "it's a fact pattern so perfect it seems contrived. Juries and judges eat it up. It speaks to credibility." The legal strategy formed quickly. It was two-pronged. First, an emergency motion for exclusive use of the marital home based on Robert's medical necessity and Clara's constructive abandonment. Second, a temporary restraining order against Clara dissipating marital assets. But here where the story twists. When Susan Gray subpoenaed the bank records, she found the expected draining of accounts. But she also found something else. A series of cash withdrawals, $9,000 total, all made in the 2 weeks prior to the lock change. All from ATMs near the gym Clara and Mark attended. And then the pivot, a call from the bank's fraud department. They had flagged a suspicious signature on a form attempting to add a new authorized user to Robert and Clara's home equity line of credit. The signature was Robert's, or a passable imitation of it. The date on the form, the Tuesday before the lock change, when Robert was in the hospital for a pre-chemo hydration session. It wasn't just abandonment, it was fraud. Clara's plan, once laid bare, was revealed in its chilling sequence. Isolate, destabilize, financially hollow out, replace. She had used the predictable schedule of cancer treatment as the clockwork for her coup. Susan Gray took this new information and did what good attorneys do. She built a narrative bomb. She scheduled a deposition for Clara, and she asked Dr. Thorne to be present, not to testify, but to observe, to be a silent, professional witness to the confrontation. The deposition room was cold, intentionally so. Clara arrived with her own lawyer, a man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. The questions began politely, establishing timelines. Then Gray leaned forward. "Ms. Clara, let's talk about Thursday, the day of the lock change. Did you know that your husband's post-chemotherapy vulnerability window was roughly between 3 p.m. and 7 a.m. the next day? I knew he was tired. Did you know that the National Cancer Institute lists safe and stable housing as a critical determinant of positive outcomes for chemotherapy patients?" Objection, relevance. "I'll rephrase," Gray said smoothly. "Did you consider your husband's medical condition when you contracted the locksmith?" "I considered my own safety." From a man who could barely stand, Gray let that hang. "Let's move to the bank records. The $9,000 in cash withdrawals, what were those for?" "Household expenses." "In cash, during a period where groceries and utilities were still being paid electronically from the same account." Gray slid a photo across the table. It was from Mark's social media, taken the weekend before the lock change. He was showing off new golf clubs, very expensive ones. "Are these the household expenses?" Clara's lawyer objected again. Clara's composure cracked. "This is character assassination." "No," Gray said quietly, "this is consequence mapping." She then placed the fraudulent signature form on the table. "Did you sign your husband's name to this document, Clara?" "No." "Do you know who did?" "Silence." Gray nodded. "I'll enter this as Exhibit 12. Now, a final question. When Dr. Thorne confronted you at the door, you stated, and I quote from his contemporaneous log, "I will not be left destitute because of this." What did you mean by this? Clara stared, trapped. The word "this" could mean the cancer, it could mean the marriage, it could mean her own actions. In that moment, the carefully constructed narrative of the suffering spouse shattered, revealing the calculating strategist beneath. As they left the deposition, Dr. Thorne felt no triumph, only a profound sadness. Susan Gray, however, was focused. "We have her," she said. "The fraud changes everything. This goes from a messy divorce to possible criminal referral, but Robert needs to decide how hard he wants to push." Back home, Robert sat in his reclaimed living room, the boxes gone. He looked at Dr. Thorne. "What do I do?" Thorne, breaking every professional boundary and yet holding onto his humanity, said, "You decide what justice looks like, but you don't have to decide alone, and you don't have to decide today." But time in cancer treatment is never a neutral party. The next chemo cycle loomed, and Clara, backed into a legal corner, was about to make a move no one saw coming. Clara's move was not a retreat. It was a lateral attack, targeting the one thing she believed was Robert's only source of strength, his doctor. 3 days after the disastrous deposition, a formal complaint arrived at the state medical board. It alleged that Dr. Aris Thorne had engaged in an inappropriate dual relationship with a patient, overstepping professional boundaries by involving himself in a marital dispute, and had used his medical authority to coerce and intimidate Clara on her own property. The complaint was carefully worded, painting Thorne not as a good Samaritan, but as a meddling neighbor exploiting his white coat for personal vengeance. For Thorne, this was a professional earthquake. A medical board inquiry is not a lawsuit. It's an existential threat to a license he'd spent 20 years building. He was now a party to the conflict, his impartial witness status incinerated. "She's trying to neutralize you," Susan Gray told him bluntly. "If the board suspends you, even temporarily, your credibility as a witness evaporates, and Robert loses his medical advocate." Robert was devastated. "This is my fault. I'll withdraw everything, just make it stop for you." "No," Thorne said, his own fear hardening into resolve. "That's exactly what she wants. You don't beat a bully by apologizing." He hired a healthcare attorney. The fight was now on two fronts, the divorce court and the medical board. But the distraction worked. While Thorne was consumed with preparing his defense, Clara executed phase 2. She filed a cross-complaint for divorce, alleging not abandonment, but emotional abuse and neglect due to Robert's illness-related volatility. She requested sole possession of the house, citing her own mental distress, and a staggering 70% of the remaining assets for her long-term support. The genius of the move was its cruelty. It weaponized Robert's cancer against him. It reframed his medical suffering as a form of domestic abuse. And it introduced a concept that would become the central battlefield: testamentary capacity. In a sealed motion, Clara's lawyer suggested Robert's judgment was compromised by aggressive chemotherapeutic agents and narcotic pain management, and requested the court appoint a guardian ad litem to assess his ability to participate in his own legal defense. Susan Gray was livid. "It's a tactic from the predatory elder abuse playbook," she told Robert. "They question your mind to control your money. We need to shut this down fast." The tool to shut it down was a neuropsychological evaluation. Robert would have to submit to hours of testing to prove he was of sound mind. The appointment was scheduled for the 1 week in his treatment cycle where he felt most human, the so-called good week. But here, where the story takes its darkest turn. The morning of the evaluation, Robert woke up with a fever, 101.8. For a chemotherapy patient with a depressed immune system, this is a 5-alarm fire. Dr. Thorne, next door, got the call. He rushed over, confirmed the fever, and knew immediately what it meant: hospital. Now. The neuropsych eval was cancelled. The legal timetable was thrown into chaos. And as Robert was being loaded into the ambulance, Clara stood on the porch with Mark. She didn't look concerned. She looked strategic. At the hospital, the diagnosis was neutropenic fever, a potentially deadly infection. Robert was admitted for intravenous antibiotics. He was out of the house, incapacitated, and utterly dependent. For Clara, it was another window of opportunity. And she took it. With Robert in the hospital, Clara moved back into the house, claiming her right to the marital asset. She changed the locks again. She also visited Robert's bank, this time with a different document, a durable power of attorney she claimed Robert had signed before his diagnosis. The signature, again, was a forgery, but it was a better one. The bank, wary from the previous fraud alert, called Susan Gray. Gray, in turn, called Dr. Thorne at the hospital. She's trying to loot the accounts while he's too sick to stop her. We need an emergency hearing. The hearing was convened by video conference from the hospital's family lounge. Robert, connected via an iPad propped on his hospital tray, looked frail in his gown. Clara, from her lawyer's office, looked composed. The judge, a no-nonsense woman, listened as Gray outlined the latest forgery and lock change. Clara's lawyer presented the power of attorney. My client is acting out of concern for her husband's affairs during this medical emergency, Your Honor. She is his wife. Then Dr. Thorne, on the same video call, asked to speak. The judge allowed it. Your Honor, I am Robert's treating oncologist. I can state that the treatment he is on does not cause cognitive impairment of the sort that would have justified a power of attorney a year ago. Furthermore, his current condition is a direct result of immune suppression from chemotherapy. Securing his home environment is not a legal luxury, it is a medical necessity for his recovery. The stress of this dispute is literally making him sicker. The judge was quiet for a long moment. Then she addressed Clara's lawyer. Where is the original of this power of attorney, the executed original? It is in a safe, Your Honor. You will produce it by 4 p.m. today for forensic examination. Until that examination is complete, and given the prior allegation of signature forgery, all accounts are frozen. Furthermore, the judge continued, her voice sharpening, the defendant will vacate the marital home by 6 p.m. today and will return all keys to the plaintiff's attorney. Failure to do so will result in immediate arrest for violation of the temporary restraining order. It was a monumental victory, but it was a victory that came with a cost. The stress had taken a tangible toll on Robert's body. His infection was slow to clear. His next chemotherapy cycle had to be delayed, a delay that could impact his long-term odds. And for Dr. Thorne, the medical board complaint was moving forward. He was now officially under investigation. The hospital administration, while privately supportive, advised him to limit his non-clinical interactions with the patient. He was being cornered by the very system he'd sworn to serve. Then the forensic examiner's report came back on the power of attorney. The signature was a forgery as expected, but the examiner found something else, a partial thumbprint on the back of the document. It didn't match Robert, it didn't match Clara. It matched Mark. Susan Gray pounced. She subpoenaed Mark's past, and what she found changed the entire geometry of the case. Mark had a history, not of violence, but of financial grift, a 2-year-old civil judgment for defrauding an elderly relative, a pattern of cozying up to vulnerable people during life transitions. Clara hadn't just found a boyfriend, she'd found a partner in crime, and this piece of information was the lever Gray needed to break the case wide open. She requested a second deposition, this time for Mark, and she invited the district attorney's office to send an observer, given the now obvious pattern of fraud. Mark, when served, panicked. His past was about to become present, and in his panic he made a choice. He decided to talk, not to Clara's lawyer, to Susan Gray. He wanted immunity. What he revealed was the true blueprint. The lock change was Clara's idea, but the financial strategy, the cash withdrawals, the forged signature on the line of credit, the power of attorney was his specialty. He admitted to practicing Robert's signature. He admitted they planned to clean out the home equity line once Robert was either committed to a facility or passed away, using the cancer as a cover. He provided texts, emails, a timeline. It was a confession. With this, the civil divorce case morphed into a potential criminal conspiracy case. The DA's office opened a file. Clara was no longer just a hostile spouse, she was a suspect. The news was delivered to Clara at the same time. She was served with Mark's sworn statement and the DA's notice. Her alliance shattered in an instant. Mark had sold her out to save himself. Alone, facing not just the loss of assets, but the prospect of felony charges, Clara did the only thing she had left. She called Susan Gray and asked for terms. Total surrender. But Robert, lying in his hospital bed, weakened but clear-minded, wasn't interested in surrender. He was interested in justice. And justice, he had come to understand, wasn't just about winning. It was about closing a door so heavy it could never be opened again. He looked at Dr. Thorne and his attorney. "What does justice look like now?" he asked, and the answer would redefine everyone involved. Justice, as it turned out, was not a single verdict. It was a cascade. The first domino fell in family court. With Mark's confession in hand, Susan Gray negotiated from absolute strength. The divorce settlement was finalized in a conference room, not a courtroom. Clara received no alimony. She was awarded a lump sum equivalent to 15% of the non-retirement marital assets, a fraction of what she'd sought. The justification in the decree was stark. The court finds the respondent's actions, including constructive abandonment and financial malfeasance during the petitioner's medical crisis, to be a clear breach of the marital duty of care, justifying a disproportionate division of assets. The house belonged solely to Robert, free and clear. Clara's name was removed from the deed. She was ordered to pay a portion of Robert's legal fees. She signed the papers without looking at anyone. The second domino was criminal. The district attorney's office, armed with Mark's testimony and the forensic evidence, offered Clara a deal: plead guilty to 1 count of felony forgery and 1 count of attempted grand theft. In exchange, they would drop the more complex conspiracy charge and recommend probation with restitution. If she went to trial and lost, she was looking at possible prison time. Clara took the deal. At her sentencing, Robert was not present. Dr. Thorne was. He watched as Clara, stripped of her defiance, stood before the judge as a convicted felon. The judge granted probation but imposed a stringent condition. She was to have no contact with Robert, directly or indirectly, for 10 years. A permanent restraining order was baked into the sentence. As she left the courtroom, she didn't glance at Thorne. The chapter was closed. The third domino was the medical board. Thorne's hearing was a quiet, procedural affair. His healthcare attorney presented his contemporaneous log. The timeline showing his interventions were in direct response to a witnessed medical emergency. They presented testimony from the hospital's ethics committee supporting his duty to act. The board dismissed the complaint in full, issuing a finding of no actionable misconduct. The word commendable was used in the closing remarks. His license was untouched, but the scar of the accusation remained. In the aftermath, life recalibrated to a new normal. Robert's chemotherapy resumed after his infection cleared. The treatments were no less brutal, but the environment was. His home was his again, a quiet, secure space. He finished his full course of treatment that fall. His follow-up scans showed no evidence of disease. He was in remission. Dr. Thorne remained his oncologist, but their relationship had irrevocably deepened. They were no longer just doctor and patient. They were comrades who had survived a different kind of battle. Robert took up gardening, turning his backyard into a vibrant, tangled oasis of tomatoes and roses. Thorne would sometimes join him after work, the two men sitting in worn patio chairs, talking about everything and nothing. But the story's final, surprising detail came a year after the settlement. Robert received a certified letter. It was from Clara's probation officer. A condition of her probation was full financial restitution. The first installment had been processed. A check fell out of the envelope. It was not a large sum, but it was symbolic. It represented the first trickle of payback for the forged home equity line of credit. Robert looked at the check for a long time. Then he endorsed it over to a local nonprofit that provided housing support to families of cancer patients. He included a note, "For those who need a safe harbor." He didn't do it for forgiveness. He did it for closure. The money was tainted, but its use could be clean. It was the final act of reclamation, turning the instrument of his betrayal into a tool for someone else's survival. The system had worked, but only because an accidental witness refused to look away. Dr. Aris Thorne often reflected on that. His medical training had taught him to treat the disease in front of him. That day on the porch, he learned that sometimes the disease is a circumstance, and the treatment is a simple, human refusal to accept cruelty. Robert never remarried. He found a profound peace in his solitude, in his garden, in the quiet certainty of his home. The man who had returned from chemotherapy to find himself locked out had, through a harrowing journey, locked in something far more valuable, an unshakable sense of his own right to exist, to heal, and to belong. The house on the cul-de-sac still stands. Two men, bound by an extraordinary story, live next door to each other. One tends his tomatoes, the other tends his patients, and both understand, in a way few ever do, that the most powerful medicine is sometimes not found in a vial, but in the courage to intervene when the world tells you to walk away. Their story is a blueprint, a map of how justice can be woven, thread by painful thread, when evidence meets ethics, and someone decides that doing the right thing is worth the cost. It ends not with a bang, but with the quiet sound of a garden gate closing and the profound peace of a battle honestly won. So what do we take from a story like this? That cruelty preys on predictable vulnerability, that the justice system, while imperfect, can work when evidence is presented by a credible witness. Those are the mechanical takeaways. But the deeper truth is more human and far more fragile. Robert's story is a testament to a single, powerful idea, that in the gap between what is legal and what is right, there is space for ordinary courage. Dr. Thorne didn't perform a miracle. He performed a simple, deliberate act of seeing. He saw a patient not just as a collection of symptoms, but as a person being dismantled in real time, and he chose to stand in the way. We often wonder what we would do in a situation like that. Would we get involved? Would we risk the hassle, the legal entanglement, the professional complaint? The answer for most of us is that we don't know until we're tested. Robert and Aris Thorne were tested by fire. Their story gives us a blueprint. Document, speak calmly, use your specific authority, whatever it may be. And understand that intervention isn't always about grand gestures. Sometimes it's about being the unshakable fact in someone else's crumbling fiction. There are Roberts everywhere, people in the middle of their own private storms, relying on the kindness of strangers who decide not to be strangers. And there are Claras too, people who see vulnerability not as a call to compassion, but as an opportunity for conquest. The balance between those forces tips on a knife's edge, and it is tipped every day by the choices of bystanders. Robert's garden thrives now. Dr. Thorne still walks his dog every evening. The house that was a fortress of betrayal is now a sanctuary of quiet recovery. The story didn't end with a dramatic victory speech. It ended with the turning of soil, the slow growth of something new from a place that was once poisoned. It reminds us that the best revenge is not living well, as the old saying goes. The best revenge is living free, free from the people who tried to break you, free in the home you rebuilt, free in the knowledge that when you were at your weakest, someone saw your strength and reflected it back to you until you could see it for yourself. If you found value in this story, if it reminded you that decency can be a powerful strategy, then do us a genuine favor, like this video. Subscribe to the channel. It costs you nothing, but it means we can keep bringing you real stories of resilience and unexpected justice. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And remember, the world is changed by the people who show up.